Part 1. The door that shouldn't be there. Ryan stood in the middle of his living room. Something was wrong. It wasn't the flickering light overhead. It wasn't the silence that felt too deep, too unnatural. It was the door, a door that wasn't there before. He stared at it, his breathing uneven. The door was on the far side of the room, embedded in the wall between the bookshelf and the TV stand. But Ryan knew it had never been there before. His apartment wasn't big. He had lived here for 3 years. He knew every inch of it, every creaking floorboard, every chip in the paint. But this door, it shouldn't exist. Ryan took a step closer. His hands felt clammy, his heart pounding harder with each movement. He reached out, slowly, fingers trembling as they hovered over the doorknob. Cold. The metal was ice cold, as if the other side of the door led to somewhere far from here, somewhere unnatural. He hesitated. His reflection wavered in the brass doorknob, his own wide eyes staring back at him, filled with confusion and something else, fear. The apartment was silent, too silent. And then the knob turned on its own. Ryan yanked his hand back, heart slamming against his ribs. No, 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 no. That didn't happen. He must be imagining things. He stepped back, breath coming in quick gasps. But then the door creaked open, just an inch, a sliver of darkness beyond, black, deeper than shadows, a black that seemed to pull at the edges of reality, swallowing the dim glow of the living room light. Ryan's chest tightened. He felt like he was being watched. And then something inside moved. He heard it, faint, a whisper of shifting fabric, the lightest scrape against the floor. His whole body went rigid. His mind screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. He was frozen, staring, waiting. The silence stretched. The door didn't open any further. Then, from the darkness inside, a breath, low, slow, not his own. Ryan stumbled backward, knocking into the coffee table. The sound of his movement shattered the heavy silence, but the door remained still. The darkness inside didn't spill out, but he could feel it. It was still there, watching. And then the phone rang. Ryan jumped, his stomach twisting. His gaze snapped to the phone on the kitchen counter. The screen was lit up. Unknown caller. The door was still slightly open, the darkness still lingering. But something told him he had to answer the phone. He took a shaky breath and reached for it. As his fingers touched the phone, the door creaked open just a little more. Part 2. The Whispering Shadows. Ryan's hand trembled as he held the phone, the screen flashing in his palm. The number was unfamiliar, and his gut twisted with the sense that he shouldn't answer. But he couldn't stop himself. His thumb slid across the screen, tapping the green button. The call connected with a faint, static buzz. And then, silence. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl. His heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to speak, but his throat felt tight, like a heavy weight had settled there. His mouth was dry, his breath shaky. Then, a voice. It was so soft, so far away, but somehow it filled the entire room. You shouldn't have opened it. Ryan froze, his blood running cold. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The voice sounded like it came from behind him, but when he turned, the living room was still empty. The door still cracked open. The shadows inside seemed to grow, stretching out further as though pulling the room into them. You know you're not alone anymore. Ryan's fingers clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. He felt the coldness of it seeping into his skin. But he couldn't hang up. Something inside him refused to. The voice continued, each word sending a chill through him. "It knows you. It's waiting for you." Ryan's breathing hitched. He needed to hang up. He needed to run. But his feet felt glued to the floor. His body refused to obey, and his mind screamed for him to leave. And then, the phone call ended. Silence again. Ryan stood there, staring at the screen in disbelief. The call had been so real. The voice, so close. It wasn't just in his head. And that's when it happened. A shadow moved inside the door. He hadn't imagined it. The darkness shifted, sliding like liquid across the walls, like something was crawling just beyond the threshold. Ryan couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he was going to suffocate right there. He could feel it. It was in the room with him. He took a step back. The door opened wider. And then it was clear. It wasn't just a shadow. Something was standing in the doorway now. Just beyond the edge of the room, it was massive, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. Ryan's legs refused to move, his body locked in place, his gaze fixed on the figure that didn't belong there. It didn't have a face. It didn't need one. Ryan's heart skipped a beat when it moved. The figure didn't walk. It glided, like it was floating just above the floor, each step leaving an imprint in the air itself. The temperature in the room dropped, his breath visible in the freezing air. And then it spoke, not in a voice, but in a whisper. "You shouldn't have opened it." Ryan tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was lost somewhere in the back of his throat, choked by terror. The figure took another step forward, and Ryan felt the air around him tighten, like invisible hands were gripping his chest. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. But it didn't stop. The figure moved closer and closer still. Ryan looked up, his vision blurry, his mind barely able to comprehend what was happening. The shadow towered over him, and he could feel its presence pressing against his skin like ice. And just when it seemed like he couldn't take it anymore, the phone rang again. This time, Ryan didn't even look. He couldn't. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadow that was now hovering inches from his face. The voice on the other end of the line, it was the same voice. "You can't leave now." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to do anymore. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. Not from the shadow, not from the door. And then, the door slammed shut. Part 3. The end of the line. Ryan's heart raced in his chest, pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through his ribs. The door had slammed shut with a deafening thud, cutting off his escape. He had no idea how long he'd been on the floor, but his body ached, his skin clammy, and his mind was clouded with a dizzying mix of terror and confusion. The phone was still ringing. The sound was deafening now, cutting through the silence that had swallowed the room. But Ryan couldn't move. He couldn't answer. The shadow was still there. It hadn't left. In fact, it had gotten closer. He could feel its presence, like a cold fog filling the room, suffocating every breath he tried to take. His legs were shaking, his hands trembling as he tried to push himself upright. The dark figure towered over him like something out of his worst nightmares, yet it felt so much more real than anything he'd ever seen. And then, the whisper again. It wasn't a voice, at least not one that he could understand with his ears. It was more like a feeling that crawled through his body, a cold shiver down his spine, settling in his stomach. "You're not going anywhere." Ryan could barely bring himself to look at it. It was like his mind refused to acknowledge its existence, but his body knew it was there. Every instinct told him to run, to get up and flee as fast as he could, but his body wouldn't listen. His legs buckled beneath him, sending him to the floor again. And then, a sudden crack broke the stillness. It came from behind him. He turned, his eyes searching the dark corners of the room, but all he could see was the shadow, the enormous oppressive shape that seemed to grow and shift with every blink. The room was colder now, much colder. His breath fogged in front of him as the temperature plummeted even further. He saw the phone screen flicker again. Unknown caller. It felt wrong, so wrong, but he couldn't stop himself from answering. His shaking hands reached for the phone, the screen illuminating his face, casting an eerie glow over his features. He pressed the green button, and the static returned, louder this time, almost deafening. Then the voice. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was closer. "You're mine now." Ryan's blood ran cold. His hands went numb, and the phone slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor. But it didn't matter. The voice continued, relentless, crawling under his skin. "You opened the door, and now you belong to me." Ryan tried to speak, to ask who it was, but his throat was so dry that no sound came out. The figure in front of him moved. It glided, its form shifting and distorting like it was made of the very darkness around it. Ryan couldn't tear his eyes away. He couldn't stop himself from staring at the thing that was now standing inches from him, its featureless face looming. It leaned in. Ryan could feel its cold, rotten breath on his skin, and his body froze in terror. "It's too late," the voice continued, its words dripping with malice. "You're in my world now." Ryan's mind screamed for him to get up, to do anything, but his body refused. His limbs were stiff, his vision swimming as the darkness swallowed the last of the light. The air around him thickened, and a strange pressure began to build, suffocating him from all sides. "You will never leave." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like the last sound he would ever hear. And then, the room shifted. He could feel it. The walls, once solid, once real, began to twist, bending and warping as if they were made of liquid, pooling together into something monstrous. The shadows were coming alive. Ryan tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't move, locked in place by an unseen force. He could only watch as the darkness closed in. It was over. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was melding together, twisting into one giant mass of blackness, swallowing him whole. And then, the last thing Ryan saw before the dark consumed him completely. The door. It was open. But now it wasn't leading back to his apartment. It led to something far worse. Part 4. Trapped in the dark. Ryan felt his breath escape him in a sharp gasp as the darkness enveloped him completely. There was no floor beneath him, no walls around him, just the suffocating void that consumed all light, all sound. He was weightless, floating in an endless abyss. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, thudding like a drum, but it felt distant, muffled by the oppressive dark. He was not alone. The presence was still there. He could feel it, watching. The shadow had followed him, or rather, had swallowed him into its world, into its realm of blackness. Ryan tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his throat too tight to let a single breath escape. He couldn't move, couldn't even twitch a finger. The very air around him felt thick, like it was pressing down on his body, holding him still, immobilized. His chest tightened with panic, but no matter how hard he fought, his limbs remained paralyzed. And then, the whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, slithering into his mind like a snake. The voice was no longer distant or faint. It was here, right inside his head. You can't run. You can't hide. Ryan's body shuddered, a deep, primal fear clawing its way to the surface. You're mine now. The words felt like a physical blow, each syllable pushing deeper into his soul, stripping away any last shred of hope. He could feel his will weakening, his sense of self fading. The shadow was taking him. It was already inside him. He tried to blink, tried to focus on something, anything, to escape this crushing pressure. But there was nothing, just endless blackness. You wanted to know, the voice continued, its tone mocking, amused. You wanted to know what's on the other side of the door. Now you're here. Welcome. Ryan's mind reeled. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. He had to wake up. He had to. But there is no waking up. The voice laughed, a sound that wasn't like any laugh he'd ever heard. It was cold and hollow, devoid of life. It echoed inside his skull, vibrating against his temples. The pressure in his chest built until he thought he might suffocate, but he still couldn't move. And then he saw it, a faint glimmer, a crack of light in the distance. It was small at first, like a flicker, but it grew, spreading, widening. Ryan's eyes locked onto it, desperate. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe he could still escape. But as the light grew, something in it shifted. It wasn't the warm light of freedom. It was cold, distant, wrong. The light turned into a shape, twisting, contorting into something unrecognizable. Ryan couldn't look away, even though he wanted to. His body was still frozen, but his mind was screaming. The shape moved closer, growing larger, and Ryan realized it wasn't light. It was a face made of shadows. It was horrific, but Ryan couldn't turn away. It was the face of something ancient, something that had never been human. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two hollow pits that stared directly into his soul. He could feel them digging into him, pulling apart the very fabric of his mind. The thing was coming closer. Ryan tried to speak, but his throat was still sealed shut. His voice, if he even had one left, was trapped deep inside him, somewhere beyond reach. "Don't be afraid," the voice whispered, now coming from the face. But it wasn't reassuring. It was taunting. "You belong to me now. You will always belong to me." It had let him go, but something had followed him back. He could feel it, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows of his apartment. The warmth of the light was still there, but it felt fragile, like it could be snuffed out at any moment. He stood, his legs unsteady, his hands gripping the edge of the table to keep himself upright. His heart was still racing, but the terror was different now. It wasn't the suffocating fear of being trapped. It was the realization that he hadn't escaped. Not really. The phone buzzed. Ryan froze. It wasn't the same ring as before. It was more like a warning, a signal. He didn't need to look at the screen. He already knew. The voice was calling him again. But this time, It wasn't coming from the phone. Ryan turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows had returned, and the door was wide open. When she returned to the house, her grandmother was already waiting by the door. Her face didn't show surprise or fear, only sorrow, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. Maria quietly nodded. "You did the right thing," her grandmother whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. Maria didn't say anything. She understood now that she didn't have to follow anyone else's path. She had walked her own, and although it had been frightening, she was ready for new beginnings. She was ready to live without fear, without the shadows of the past. The pendant was still in her hands, and it was no longer a burden. Now it was a symbol of her strength, her ability to stand up for her freedom. The night once again enveloped the house, but now, without the heavy feeling it had carried before. All the sounds seemed normal again. She began to feel calm, no longer feeling the gaze that had haunted her. The shadow was gone and Maria was free,